Hey everybody, it's Mike. Welcome back to the channel. So I've changed my YouTube channel name just because I was bored to Surviving BPD and Narc Relationship Trauma, because that's really what we're talking about here. So today I want to talk to you about narcissistic abuse syndrome, or also known as narcissistic abuse victim syndrome, or something like that. Anyway, it'll be there correctly in the title. So what is narcissistic abuse syndrome? I just recently heard about this. You'd think I would have known about this, but in doing my research for this channel, I came across this term, which I don't know if it's still being used, but it was used, a couple of years ago anyway. Narcissistic abuse syndrome. So what is narcissistic abuse syndrome? And then I'll tell you my thoughts about it. I'll tell you what I really think it is. And then I'll tell you some of the pitfalls that are associated with this name and people that are talking about it, at least the videos that I've seen, some of the pitfalls in how they go about healing from it. So narcissistic abuse syndrome is pretty self-explanatory. It is being presented as a syndrome, maybe even a disorder, as a result of narcissistic abuse. And that apparently could be as a result of narcissistic abuse in your family of origin, or later narcissistic abuse by romantic partners, or somebody who had some kind of power over you and was narcissistically abusing you. And so when you go and watch these videos, you will hear the 10 signs, or the 18 signs, or the 5 signs, or the whatever it is. And they'll give you signs so that you can identify whether or not you suffer from narcissistic victimization syndrome or narcissistic abuse syndrome. So what they will say oftentimes is that you suffer from low self-esteem, you suffer from fear, you suffer from rumination, anxiety, you suffer from negative self thoughts, negative self experiences. The list goes on and on and on. But really what it is that they're talking about PTSD or CPTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. All of the symptoms that they give are symptoms of PTSD. But the one thing that I agree with about it is that there is a particular, there's PTSD, like people who come back from wars, they suffer from PTSD. But there's a specific type of PTSD that comes about as a result of being in close contact, relationship, repeated contact with somebody who is a narcissistic abuser, either somebody who suffers from narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder, and probably other types of narcissistic abusive people. And so the one thing that I agree with about it is that there needs to be an understanding that there is a specific type of PTSD that is unique to narcissistic abuse. Now, it's going to have, the same general symptoms as any other kind of PTSD, but then there's going to be specific ways that somebody functions who has been a victim of narcissistic abuse. So here's my thoughts on it, very simply. Well, the other thing that I want to say, as I listen to the videos, especially if you use the term narcissistic victim syndrome, if you use that term, what you're going to hear is people focusing on their victimization. And so that will be a main theme, which is that they, it may not have been said in this way, but the feeling will be that they are helpless victims, that they were walking down the street one day, they were perfectly fine, and then the next thing they knew, they were innocently targeted, and outside of their conscious control, they were taken into a scenario where they were repeatedly abused by a narcissist, and that narcissistic abuse then created this damage whereby even after the relationship is over, they still suffer from this syndrome. So there's a lot of things that I agree with about all of that. So there are some assumptions again about it. One is that people who suffer from narcissistic abuse syndrome, one of the things that you'll hear over and over again is the way to overcome this, and now this explains a lot. The way to overcome this, or one of the ways to overcome this. I'm not saying this. This is what you will find if you do research on this, at least YouTube research. They will say you have to learn everything you can about narcissism. So in other words, become obsessed about narcissism. Learn how narcissists think, how they act, what's going on with them, why they do what they do, their tactics, their abuse tactics, all of that. Learn, in other words, learn to unmask the narcissist. And so apparently that will give you some kind of power to heal yourself from this syndrome. So this syndrome, narcissistic abuse syndrome, or narcissistic victimization syndrome, is of course not something that you find in clinical settings. You won't find it in the DSM. There isn't a psychologist or a psychiatrist out there who will say, open up to a page in the DSM and say narcissistic abuse syndrome. It doesn't exist. And that's because just because it's kind of a brand new thing that's, phrase that's being introduced to the collective unconscious, but also because I think there's some misunderstanding and perhaps some ignorance, well-meaning, by people who have come up with this phrase and people who treat this. Now, you will see, if you go on YouTube, you will see no shortage of life coaches, which I don't consider myself a life coach because I don't, on this channel, even though these links here are from my other channel, I don't consider myself a life coach because I don't take anybody from this channel. I tried that. People asked, will you take clients? And so I tried it for a little bit, and I've decided that for a bunch of different reasons, I don't want to. And one of them is I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and I don't want to be. That doesn't mean that I don't want to come onto this channel and hypothesize and psychoanalyze. I do want to do that, but there's a difference between sort of philosophizing about it and actually being a therapist. And I don't want to be a therapist in that way. So what was I saying? So there isn't a classification. It doesn't technically exist. It's well-meaning because, as I said in the beginning, there is a particular kind of PTSD specific to people who have been abused by narcissists repeatedly over time, either in romantic relationships or close associations, or especially in families of origin. If your parents were narcissistic, then this is going to create this syndrome. I absolutely 100% support the concept that it is a syndrome. I absolutely support the concept that it is something that goes beyond going through a challenging, difficult scenario. Listen, you can go through something difficult, a death, a breakup, a divorce, a natural disaster, illness, bad luck, poverty. You can go through a bunch of really negative, bad luck, even really damaging things that take time to recover from. But you wouldn't classify them as a syndrome. There are things that happen to everybody. They're traumatic, but you have the ability to overcome them and heal from it. The death of a loved one, the death of family members, those kinds of things. They're incredibly traumatic, but it's in the realm of human experience. And even though it can be damaging, time will heal. Time heals all. Time will heal those things. I like the idea of a classification of a syndrome because I agree with the sentiment that if you are somebody who has suffered or suffers from PTSD as a result of repeated narcissistic abuse, I absolutely agree that it creates a syndrome inside the individual that does not go away on its own. Once you're out of that once you're no longer living at home with your narcissistic parents, that doesn't make the programming go away. If you were in a romantic relationship with somebody who suffers from narcissistic personality disorder, the damage that happens as a result of that will not go away with time. In fact, it may even continue at the same level, or in some cases even get worse. The syndrome itself, the anxiety, all of the negative things associated with it. So I'm in full agreement with that. I don't agree with a lot of the proposed treatment for it for a bunch of reasons that I could get into. But let me tell you exactly what narcissistic abuse syndrome or narcissistic victimization syndrome is. Are you ready? There's already a word for it. There's already a word for it that also does not exist in the DSM. It is not, even though it is a word and a phrase that's been around for a long time. It's a word, not a phrase. It's a word that's been around for a long time, and all psychologists and psychologists are aware of it. Many may not recognize it or deal with it because it's not classified as a disorder of any kind or a syndrome. And that is simply the word codependence. So a lot of you are scratching your head going, I'm not a codependent. So first off, they're just like narcissistic abuse syndrome doesn't exist technically. It is something that anybody who identifies with it can take it and define it however they want. The word codependence is also one of those words. It doesn't technically exist in the psychiatric field, the psychological field. There's no classification in the DSM for codependence. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it is. So I'm simply telling you that that's all that narcissistic abuse syndrome is. Now, some of you are going to scratch your heads and go, no, that's not true because, codependents aren't necessarily as bad off. That's true. So if we take codependence, if you look at it as a syndrome, I think that's a good way to look at it. It's not a personality disorder. I think a syndrome is good. I'm using syndrome in my own definition, which is I don't identify it as a personality disorder, which is a psychosis. It means somebody who has a personality disorder means that they aren't going to be able to cure the cause of their disorder. They may be able to heal to some degree. They may even learn how to manage their symptoms, but they suffer from a mental illness where there is a psychosis involved, where their connection to objective reality is hampered. And so when that happens, you have psychosis. Psychosis, means being separated from objective reality, in some particular way. Neurosis is somebody who still has a connection to objective reality, but has a problem with it. So they're in conflict with objective reality, and they have some neurosis about it. It can be just as painful as psychosis, but they haven't, completely disconnected from objective reality. So I would put codependence, when it's not associated with a personality disorder, I'll get to that in a second, I would put neurosis, codependence under the banner of neurosis. And so generally speaking, you could say, in terms of narcissistic abuse syndrome, the person who is suffering from narcissistic abuse syndrome generally is going to be a codependent who is under the umbrella of neurosis, not psychosis. Now, what does that mean? So first I need to give you my definition of codependence. So I read this once and I thought it was great. Codependence is a relationship dynamic. So there's the codependent, and then there's just codependence. Codependence is a relationship dynamic where two people are together, one person ends up taking up the slack for somebody else who is dysfunctional. And so this term codependent came into being with the birth of Alcoholics Anonymous. So they needed to come up with a word for, at that time, mostly the wives of the alcoholics, because way back 100 years ago, basically that's what it is. You had mostly men, mostly businessmen, mostly alcoholics, and then you had their wives. And their wives had to pick up after them, had to clean them up, had to clean up their puke, had to get an extra job so that they had to hold the relationship together. And so they weren't they weren't dependent on alcohol, but they were the codependent because they were merged with the dependent person, the alcoholic who was dependent on alcohol. Get it? Codependent. People get bent out of shape over the word dependent. They say, I'm not dependent. Of course not. The codependent is usually the one who takes all the responsibility for the relationship. I'm the one that held down the job. I'm the one that cleaned the house. I'm the one that, took care of him when he was sick or when he was, So that's where that word comes from. And so to understand codependent, back a long time ago, they just used to use the word the co. Who's the co here? This was 30 years ago. I can remember in that sense, they wouldn't use the word codependent as much. There would be like the alcoholic or the drug addict, and then there would be the co. Who was the co? Co meant that you were commingled with the dependent. So those of you who bristle at that, I'm not a codependent. Are you the person who was commingled with the dysfunctional person? Yes, I was the one that took responsibility. I was the responsible one. Then you're the codependent. Get it? So it's a dynamic where you take up the slack for somebody else's dysfunction. That's it. So that's codependence. That's not a syndrome. That is just a relationship dynamic. Then there is the codependent. The codependent is somebody who, of course, the codependent can fulfill multiple roles, but the underlying definition that I'm using of codependent is somebody whose value is based solely on what they do, not who they are. In other words, their value in the relationship, and even in their minds, their value in the world is going to be based on one thing, which is what they do. Now, that means that you have a transactional relationship with everything and everybody, but this will be more intensely experienced with the dysfunctional counterpart, the alcoholic, the drug addict, the narcissist, the borderline, the sex addict, the gambling addict. It doesn't matter. Whoever is the dysfunctional person, whether they're neurotic or psychotic, you're the one that is taking up the slack. And the reason why you are taking up the slack is because at the very least in that relationship, your value in that relationship is based solely on your ability to meet the dysfunctional needs of the other person, the alcoholic, the narcissist. All right? That's, now you can't argue, because the people who come onto my channel and write these long diatribes about I'm not a codependent, you should know what I put up with, I worked 2 jobs and I took care of them and I fed the kids for 20 years and I'm not a codependent, I'm not dependent on anybody. No, but you were completely basing your value in the relationship, and the other person had labeled you as your only value to them is what you do for them. So in the case of, if somebody, in the case of the narcissist, the typical narcissistic person, then your value is based on, avoiding their rage, avoiding their insecurity, making sure that you always placate their ego. That is a codependent strategy based on your value. Your value to them is what you do for them, right? So that is opposite from a, quote, healthy relationship, which is when 2 people are together and they love each other simply because the other person exists. They truly love the other person unconditionally. What they think of what will make this person happy, and simultaneously they are also wanting and expecting to be loved simply because of who they are, and they are wanting their partner to give to them simply because it makes them happy to know that you are happy. That would be healthy. The unhealthy one is your job is to meet whatever their needs are, and your job is to sacrifice your boundaries, sacrifice your sense of self, and your only value is whether or not you meet their narcissistic needs. Okay? So that's the codependent. So with that, this would definitely, if you have narcissistic narcissistic abuse syndrome, that person who suffers from narcissistic abuse syndrome, you're going to see, if you talk to them, they will either consciously or just in context define themselves as, my job was to be this for that person, and if I didn't do this and do this way, so and so would get upset, and in order to keep them happy I had to, we talk about narcissistic supply. You have to give the narcissist their supply in whatever their form of narcissism is, right? Got it? So that is the codependent. The codependent is somebody whose value in the relationship is of a transactional nature, where their value in the relationship is based solely on what they do for the narcissist, the alcoholic, the abuser, whoever they are. That's what makes you a codependent, not because you're dependent on anybody or any of that other stuff, which may or may not be true. You may be dependent on other people's love and approval. You may be insecure. All those things may be true, but that's not what makes you a codependent. What makes you a codependent is that you are you are commingled with the person who is dependent, and that person is dependent on you to act a certain way, to fulfill a certain role, and if you do not fulfill that role, they have no use for you. We talk about narcissistic discard. They discard you when you no longer, in their mind, fulfill their needs. Their love for you, their acceptance of you, their attention, their connection with you is based solely on you supplying them with their narcissistic supply needs, right? That doesn't matter if we're talking about alcoholics, drug addicts, abusers, borderlines, narcissists, it doesn't matter, right? You with me? So all I'm hearing when I hear this narcissistic abuse syndrome is that people are recognizing that there is a specific type of PTSD that is associated with narcissistic relationships. So I mentioned alcoholics and drug addicts. They have codependence, but alcoholics and drug addicts aren't necessarily full-blown narcissists. They probably are narcissistic. They may even be narcissistic abusers, but there's a difference between that kind of abuse, even though as horrible as that is, and the kind of abuse that comes from somebody who actually suffers from a personality syndrome, a mental illness whereby they are narcissistic, they're sociopathic. Alcoholics and drug addicts aren't necessarily sociopathic, aren't necessarily psychopathic, and they might have psychopathic tendencies, narcissistic tendencies, but they're not full-blown sociopaths. They're not without love and empathy and all the self-awareness. They're not devoid of that. The narcissist and the person suffering from a personality disorder has some form of psychopathy, sociopathy, where they do not have normal empathy, right? We're all on the same page. So here's the thing. So now that's an explanation. Hopefully that explains it. That the source, this is the thing that bothers me about this. The thing that bothers me about narcissistic abuse syndrome is that as everything that's in its infancy, the only thing that really defines it is that somebody has been abused by a narcissist and it has caused them this lasting damage that's creating this internal syndrome that creates a perpetual victimization of them. And I'm in full agreement with that, except that the assumption is that it just sort of happens out of nowhere. That the person with the syndrome has has nothing to do with the dynamic. They say it takes two to tango. So if you take it from their perspective, they're just walking along and somebody grabbed them and forced them to dance with them. I don't want to dance. I don't want to do the tango. It takes two to tango. So what's missing is that in order for there to be a narcissistic bond that can create this narcissistic abuse, except in the case of children born into narcissistic abuse, they had nothing to do with that. If you're an adult and you end up in a relationship that creates this syndrome, then you had to engage. You had to be part of it. So that's the thing. When I'm listening to all these channels, people talking about it, and even so-called experts, I've listened to videos from psychologists and life coaches, and from just your average victim. And in all of those cases, there's this underlying assumption that the victim is just that. They're an innocent, helpless victim, and they had no interaction whatsoever to create the dynamic. So this is one of the reasons why people bristle at the idea of codependence, even if they don't understand it. On my channel, I say if you've been in a relationship with a narcissist or a borderline, you are by definition a codependent. And people bristle at that. They don't like hearing that. And the reason is because whether they realize it or not, it means that they don't like the idea that they actively, deliberately, whether that be conscious or unconscious, helped to feed and create the dynamic. They don't want to take responsibility for their part of their own victimization. They don't want to take any responsibility, and the thought that they had something to do with it, that they are partly responsible for the dynamic that they chose to continue to be in, that makes them very upset. They don't like hearing that. Some people may realize that and some people don't. The people that get upset at the word dependent say, I'm not a dependent, you don't understand. What they're really saying is, I'm not responsible. And I didn't do anything to be a part of this syndrome, this relationship. I got involved, and you don't understand. They loved bombed me. They sought me out. They targeted me. They conned me. All of those things may be true. But, just to give you an example, I almost yesterday ended up almost giving away my bank information to an online con artist. I was selling a surfboard, and somebody contacted me and said, "Oh, I want to buy your surfboard, but I live in another city. Can you send it to me?" And I said, "Well, how would we do that?" And they say, "Oh, don't worry, I'll pay for it, and then the money will go into your bank, and I'll pay for somebody to come pick it up." And that sounds really good. And then they sent me this link, and I clicked on the link, and it went to the website of gumtree.com.au. I'm in Australia, and it looked good, and it's all it was asking. And it says sold. I'm selling my board for $700. Sold $700. Delivered to this address, and then it asks for your bank card information. And I was about to do that. I was like, but then all I did was I just simply Googled, just did a little bit of research, and without getting into the specifics, found out, yeah, Gumtree does not do that. And anybody who does that, you never just hand out your bank card information to somebody. And I realized that it was a con. But the way that those cons work, the word con comes from confidence job. Con man is a confidence man. They gain your confidence. The only way a con man can gain your confidence is if you have some greed. You have some personal desire, something that you want. Somebody comes and sells you, they're going to sell you the Golden Gate Bridge for a really inexpensive price, and you can go up and put up a toll booth. I'll sell it to you for $5. The only reason you're going to believe that is if your greed makes you, give them the $5. This is how people get into pyramid schemes. When it's too good to be true, it usually is. But the con man knows, if I can find the guy who's really greedy, I can sell him on it, I can con him. So the same is true with narcissists. Narcissists are confidence men. Borderlines are confidence men and women. They love bomb you. The love bombing phase is the con. They are conning you. But if you don't have a need or desire, usually an unrealistic one, like falling madly in love with the perfect person, in the span of 24 hours, that's a sign of maybe things are too good to be true. You've been conned. It means that there was a part of you that wanted something. That's the thing that's missing in this, is that when we talk about the victims of narcissistic abuse, using these terms, they just fit right into untreated codependence. And that's the sad part, and I'll end this video with this. The sad part of it all is that in my experience, I'm somebody who survived and completely healed myself from a very toxic relationship with a woman who suffered from untreated borderline personality disorder. It was easily the most concentrated toxic experience of my whole life. And the damage that I suffered even after the relationship was over was unbelievable. And there's no doubt that had I not done the things that I teach you to do here, if I hadn't done those things, I would still either be in that relationship or I would still be suffering from this very thing, narcissistic abuse syndrome. And so there is a way out. And the way out is, as I talk on my channel, is to do the 4 things. So if you want to recover completely from, at the very least, the damage done to you by the specific relationship, then do these 4 things. The first one is you have to go completely no contact, which means you have to make it impossible for the other person to contact you. Not just not calling them. I won't get into that, but that means no matter what it takes, you throw your phone away, you move, whatever it takes so that they cannot find you. So you go completely no contact. It's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. Number 2, you go to coda.org, Codependence Anonymous, and you go to a Zoom meeting. You can go to a live one or a Zoom, doesn't matter where you are in the world. Don't tell me I can't go to CODA because they don't have it in my country. Doesn't matter. You can go to an online meeting. And it's not about going to the meeting, it's about getting a sponsor, finding somebody who will walk you through the 12 steps. Work the 12 steps with somebody who has done the 12 steps, and then sponsor somebody else. That's thing number 2. If you haven't done what I just described, you haven't done thing number 2. Number 3 is to get a therapist, a psychologist who's familiar with narcissistic personality disorder, cluster B personality disorders, and what goes on with that. And you can do that at any point in the process. I listed as number 3, but you can do that at any point in the process. And then the 4th one is to do some kind of daily meditative practice. If you do those 4 things, like your life depends on it, every day, you will completely heal. At some point, I can't tell you how long it'll take, but at some point you will completely heal from that damaging relationship. In terms of if the family of origin stuff, if you grew up in a narcissistic, abusive situation, that's not going to go away, unfortunately, immediately. You're probably going to have to work on that for the rest of your life. Sorry, but that's my experience. All right, so I just wanted to make a video about narcissistic abuse syndrome and my thoughts about it. All right. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you all very soon.